Thank you guys for making the time to be here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Okay. Taking roll, I am present. Member Kirby.
Here.
Chair Loeffler-Kemp.
Here.
Member Lofald.
She may be a little late. She's coming from the cities.
Member Oswald.
Here.
Member Sandstead.
Here.
Member Trinka.
Here.
Superintendent Gronseth.
Here.
Assistant Superintendent Horton.
Here.
Deputy Clerk Erickson.
Here.
Secretary Dolans. And Secretary Thibault, I would assume, are excused, as are our student reps. All right. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So just a reminder that Committee of the Whole meetings, we do not do any voting. And the reason for this meeting is to do the budget review. We've had numerous meetings on the budget since February. Additional information was emailed out earlier today, and there are some hard copies someplace. So we're going to have CFO Erickson do a presentation. Want to just ahead of time really thank, I know Kathy and Peggy and administration have been working some pretty long hours to pull everything together over the last few weeks, and as was noted in the presentation we had last week at the Committee of the Whole meeting. So just thank you ahead of time, and we will move forward then with your presentation, and then we'll open it up for questions after. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I really do appreciate the opportunity to meet with you one more time. It's not just because I love to talk about the budget and force you to come extra times just for fun, even though that would be a great reason to get together. The process of going through the budget is a complex one, and as we are putting together information and getting feedback from you, which I really do appreciate for those of you that we've had either discussions over the phone or emails that we've connected on, it helps me and helps us better share information with you so that we're putting together information that's of value to you. That's very important to me, that we're not just presenting a set of numbers that might mean something to me, but I want them to mean something to all of you as well. So I think as we've gone through this process, we have edited and changed and added information that hopefully is user-friendly and understandable, and we certainly will continue to appreciate any feedback or suggestions that you have as we move forward. So the hope today is to go a little bit deeper into some of the suggestions that we've received from you and others, so that it helps give some clarity to where the budget is. The presentation that was posted to Board Book today, the first 12 pages are identical to the pages you saw at our Committee of the Whole on June 4th. So those first 12 pages, I'm not going to spend any great amount of time going over any of those pieces because you have seen those before and I have received some feedback from you. But as we kind of just walk through the highlights of where we are, and then we'll get to those 4 extra pages, which I hope will provide some insights into some of the pieces of how we got to these larger numbers of where the budget is. And so this first page of showing you the budget by fund. And again, just as a reminder, the general fund is general, transportation, and capital. So those are those funds 1, 3, and 5 that you might have seen on other reports or old versions of reports, that they're all rolled into that one fund that we call the general fund, because that's how the state of Minnesota recognizes it. They don't recognize a transportation fund or an operating capital fund. Those are local choices. Most districts throughout the state do have those, but that's where that is. And then again, we introduced at the Committee of the Whole on June 4th the other funds, the revenues and expenses in each one of those areas. And just as an aside, we will continue to be analyzing, updating, and looking at each of these budget areas all throughout the summer. Just because June 18th comes and hopefully we have a board resolution to approve this budget doesn't mean the budget process is over. It's really just beginning. It truly is an ongoing live document that we will continue to edit and adjust as we keep moving forward. So again, these budget numbers have not changed since our June 4th meeting as far as As funds, this is our current projections, where we think the budget will be for fiscal year 20. As I scroll down, again, the summary of the revenues, we've talked about those, just highlighting that for our general fund, the state is our biggest supplier of revenue. We are projecting still the 8116 pupil counts, so just as a reminder, those are a little bit lower than where we had been a few months ago, slightly higher than where we were back in February. And as I mentioned at the business committee meeting on Tuesday, projections look like we're going to be right on for fiscal year 19 so far. The first Mars reports for year-end final came out. They look low, so if you're one of those people that goes out and looks for those reports, our Mars report does not include all of our students yet. So if you were to look at it compared to our budget, it may seem a little low, but our independent study students have not yet been recorded in Mars, so the estimates that we've done put us right on track. So we feel pretty good about that number, which was around 8178. So the projection of 8116 seems reasonable because, again, in fiscal year 18, we were at 8215, down to 8178. So the 8116 seems like a reasonable amount to see a general but slight decline in enrollment for our students. Looking at our revenue budget summary again, we've looked at this several times. We do have restricted and unrestricted funds. We have those reserves that have requirements attached to those, and then we have other funds that we receive that have purpose but don't necessarily have a required reserve. So we did try to break those out, and hopefully that was helpful for those of you that wanted to see that in a little more detail. And again, at the bottom, just a reminder that we had some impacts to the fiscal year 20 budget from the revenue side that we needed to factor in. The two losses were the loss of compensatory revenue from the aid entitlement reports, and then also that fiscal year 17 referendum adjustment that is unfortunately not should not have been a factor in fiscal year 20, but because of the way the system works and how levy adjustments work, that correction is falling in fiscal year 20, and we must accept that as part of the levy process. So that means we just spent those dollars in a previous fiscal year, and now they're saying we need to retrieve those dollars back, and they weren't a part of a prior year entitlement. We are projecting that increase based on the basic formula allowance, and as I've mentioned in other meetings where we've been together, we had projected that early on. So when the legislature settled and we heard the 2 and 2 for those districts who were able to maybe be more conservative in their estimates, they may have seen a windfall there. We did not. We had already planned and budgeted that full 2%, so that was a part of our existing budget. But nevertheless, it's a increase that we need and is very important, so we're very grateful. And then again, we have the projected new referendum dollars that are coming in from last November. We've looked at the revenue or the expenditures in the general fund by program area. We'll talk about this a little bit more in our supplemental pages, but again, we'll be focusing on that elementary and secondary instruction area. Again, these are our program areas that include both restricted and unrestricted funds. They include our special education and other areas. So again, this full 110 million, 0.9 is all of those general fund areas. Again, looking at our same general fund by object code, how do we spend our dollars, not necessarily where do we spend our dollars. Again, we see that the salary and benefit pieces are our largest pieces, and hopefully we can tie some FTEs to those now, so that hopefully that will help give some clarity to, of all these dollars that we spend, the 64 million and over 20 million in benefits, where are those being spent throughout the district? We'll look at those FTEs. And again, the contracted services also may include people, but they're not our employees. We talked about the highlights of where we saw changes and investments in our considerations in both the revenues and expenditures, and I think we're all aware of where the pluses and minuses came in, so we won't go into detail there. But again, if you have any follow-up questions, these are the things we know right now. We continue to analyze and understand where our budgets are coming from, and keeping in mind that I did want to mention that, you know, last year's activity can have an impact on this year's budget, which will roll into our 20 budget. We're always working on estimates. We always have to make assumptions on our revenues, and when the actual revenues are calculated, keeping in mind that for schools, we don't know how much we're actually going to receive in revenue until 6 months after the fiscal year is over, because the student counts don't become final until 6 months after the fiscal year is over. So the numbers we're seeing today, and we've worked very closely with Kateri, she feels really good about those numbers, but this first run won't be final until November. So we won't find out actually what our actual revenues are until almost the time that the audit is completed. So we could be going on an assumption that we have a set of revenue coming in, and when those final numbers come in and we set up our receivables, if those are off, lots of things play into effect. And then certainly the example of the levy adjustment from fiscal year 17, the levy works up to 4 fiscal years worth of information on 1 year. So we're often impacted by things that are happening not because of what we're trying to do, but because of either final information or updated information from prior years. So a lot of things happen inside that are buried inside of this budget that aren't necessarily completely related to the fiscal year 20 upcoming fiscal year that we're going to be talking about and budgeting for. We introduced for the first time the different funds. These have not changed. I know we're continuing to work on community education. We have just some tweaking to do there. They do have a fund balance, so right now we're projecting a deficit for community service, but they will also have some fund balance to have that covered, and then we'll be working with them to do any adjustments there as well. And again, some of our separate funds like food service and community service have multiple sources of revenue, but as we get into some of our other sources, such as debt service, the majority is coming from local, which would be our taxpayers, with a small amount of state aid coming through long-term facilities. And then our trust fund is all local, so that's because that is all monies coming in that we're doing a transfer for. In addition, we have an internal dental fund, which is all our user fees that come in, and then we pay those out. And then finally, our student activity accounts are all local as well. So as we kind of walked through all those different pieces, and if you were to scroll all the way back up to the beginning, that's that summary page where we're saying this is actually what we're asking you to approve for fiscal year 20 as a budget, and all those different funds, revenues, and expenditures. But what we wanted to spend a little more time on, which I hope these will be helpful for you, and again, we would appreciate any feedback or questions, or again, if we can provide any further follow-up information that can be helpful for you. We had gotten questions regarding our projected enrollments for the buildings, and as well as what our sections look like as far as FTE staffing. So that's what this grid is showing. And so what we have here are our projected enrollments. So you can see the fiscal year 20 enrollments. I have one page for elementary and one page for secondary, which is the middle and high schools, because they all don't fit all on one page. Otherwise the numbers get really tiny. So again, you can see that this, and I do have some bullets at the bottom. Again, the enrollment is subject to change. And every year, once we get to the end of the summer and we hear enrollments, if there's things that are material changes that we need to be considering, we would do that. But as of right now, I think the enrollment estimates, both the building administration and Kateri, our Mars person, and other administrators have reviewed our estimates, and I think they seem reasonable at this point. Again, with the sections, the premise that we went on for the district buildings was for fiscal year 19, those FTEs would roll into fiscal year 20 unless the building administrator wanted to do some changes in the building, keeping in mind that we only had a set amount of money, a set amount of resources for that building. So if they needed to do something different, we needed to find a way to make that whole. The good news was, as far as our enrollment trends, there were not any material differences in enrollment that would have triggered any more or less FTE. I think there was one building that had a 0.5 less and another building that had a 0.5 more. So we ended up as a total FTE in elementary at the same amount that we had in fiscal year 19. So again, as you see these are very similar to where we were. Comment on Lowell. So Lowell does have the immersion programs, and we do have to add new FTE because the Spanish continues to accelerate to a new grade level. So when we had to do that, we had to add additional FTE for that new grade level progressing. So that is an add-on to the building from last year. So that would be the only building that was materially different, but because it wasn't because of enrollment, it was the addition of the grade level. Does that make sense to everybody? Yeah, and Ojibwe as well. So that was built in as part of the budget process, is that Lowell would need new FTE because of the continuation of the immersion program.
Can we have her finish the presentation and then ask questions? That's what I'd like to do.
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
So I was going to say, is there any questions on this page? But I'll hold off until. Going to the next page then for secondary. This is a little small to see, so I hope you also have this on a computer or on copies. We looked at the middle school enrollments, which are on the top row. Again, these are estimates that we worked with our Mars folks and talking with our building administration. Just a couple clarifications, so I don't want as we were putting this together, there's so many nuances at the secondary level that are higher, so that make this a little more complicated when we first put this together. I just want to offer some clarifications on what we have as far as the numbers. So at the middle school, when you see 6th grade, I had allocated the FTE that were associated with 6th grade. That would be the core teachers. 6th grade also utilizes the specialists like art, gym. They're buried inside of 7th and 8th grade. So the class sizes look artificially high, but that's because they don't include, and we didn't have a breakout of how much time of FTE of those specialists go to 6th grade versus the 7th and 8th grade at this moment. So I would just say if you could look at the last column as the average class size for the building based on the FTE that we have, that's what we would be closer to. So in the case of Lincoln, it would be the 21.59, and then in the case of Ordine East, they're at 26.18 based on their regular certified teachers, regular and vocational. And then in addition, we have some certified support staff in these buildings, which would be counselors, social workers, interventionists. They're not a traditional classroom teacher, but they provide student support. So we calculated what those FTE were. And again, sort of like a similar, you hear maybe counselor per student ratios throughout the state. This is kind of our support staff per building. So even though we say it's 83.82 for Lincoln, all that's doing is saying, here's how much support per site estimate we have. So again, Lincoln has about 7.6 FTE of support staff in their building, which would equate to serving every 83 students. And then at Ordine East, they have about 5.2, and that would serve about every 210 students. Keeping in mind, want to make sure both on the elementary and secondary, these FTE, and this is in the footnote, could be utilizing general fund, compensatory revenue, and title revenue. These are not broken out. These are our sites, so we wanted to do it by site. So it would make sense that those buildings that have more access to revenues that others don't should have more FTE and a lower per student ratio because they have access to different dollars than the others. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. So again, on the middle schools, the support staff, and again, we'll correct these and edit these, but the 6th grade, I just want to be clear, we don't have 41 kids in a class at Ordine, but the average of the core, that's what we have, and then they also get supported by the specialists that are in the building, which are inside of the 7th and 8th grade FTE, part of that 41.9 total secondary and vocational FTE, and similar with Lincoln, part of that 29.5 also goes into helping in that specialist area. In the high school area, again, we took the total secondary, regular, and vocational FTEs, took all of their classes, grades 9 through 12, estimated population, and we can see that they're averaging about 24.8 students per FTE. And then at East High School, they have about 26.42 for this is just their regular, this does not include special education. And then similar, the certified site support staff FTE, which again includes the social workers, interventionists, counselors. For Denfeld, they have approximately 5.7, and then at East High School, they have just 4. So you can see that those serve one of every 150 students at Denfeld, and then one of every 350 students at East. This does not include, if you look at the footnote, does not include special ed. But what I want to make sure that everyone knows is that the pupil count estimates include every student. So if there's students, say for example, in a level 3 program that are broken out in another site, they're included in these building-wide estimates, but they wouldn't necessarily, we'd have to pull those students out and then the additional FTE that's attached to those. So there's a little bit of moving parts here, but because of the complexity of identifying which students are where, it was just a little bit more difficult for us. So this does not include our special education FTE teachers. It also does not include administration, so these are just our certified staff with the students, but we'll get there because we did have that question. And then, of course, for high schools, this does not include the ALC or AEO programs. They have a separate site number, they're budgeted separately, so they're not included as part of either the middle or high school costs here, or FTEs. Going to the next page. And again, hopefully this will provide a little more information. So we went just beyond just the certified staff and said who's in all of our buildings. So I was hoping that this would help for those that had some questions on what do we have at each one of our sites as far as personnel. So again, we have our staffing for administration. You can see those up at the top. The classroom teachers would then correlate to the FTEs of our certified staff that we did that analysis of the classrooms that we have in our buildings. We also have our specialists, and again, we have interventionists. You can see where certain buildings have, and this was one giant spreadsheet that included both elementary and secondary, so you might see some categories that don't have any activity. That's most likely because they're in the secondary and not in the elementary, or elementary into the secondary. And again, we did include special education here, so you can see how much FTE is here for our special ed services and other support staff like paraprofessionals, our hourly instructional assistants, playground monitors, and other folks. So again, you can see those totals at the bottom, and then again, you can look and compare what the enrollment is for the building compared to how much site staff that they have. Again, this does not include facilities, food service, community education, or district-wide. I think it's important to understand that some of our staff, because of how coding works and because of how different programs work, if a staff person is utilized at multiple sites, oftentimes the Department of Education will request that they be coded as a district-wide person. So in our world, that's the 005 code, if you've ever seen that in a coding structure. They may only be at 4 or 5 schools, and rather than taking 20 or 25% of that person and allocating them out to 4 different sites, they just get coded into a district-wide. So they're not a site allocation, but they affect and have impacts on those sites. So that's part of the complexity on the finance side is when you're trying to determine what the cost per student per site or the cost per allocation, there's a lot of complexity there where we may not actually be seeing everyone that has an impact on the site because they're district-wide folks. And we have all kinds of district-wide people in the district who may be serving 1 or 2 different places, but because of how the coding structure is and just historical coding structure here at the district, they've been coded in a different way. So just kind of keep that in mind that this may not be reflective of everyone who's in a building. We may have someone who goes to a building once a week, and I'm just thinking of Ron Lake, for example, who goes to Lester Park, but he's a district-wide employee because he goes multiple places and serves multiple roles, but for one part of the day, he's at Lester Park doing work for them. So there's all kinds of different people in different places. So just kind of keep that in mind, that this may not be all inclusive of everyone who may have an impact on students and sites at each of the buildings. We can look at the secondary, which is the last page, which is the additional page that we have. And again, just some notes. And as we go through, I just changes or adjustments that happen to FTEs as a result of the multiple meetings we've had with the building administrators. They worked with their site teams, their CITs, they looked at what their needs were, and so if we had adjustments or changes compared to what is in fiscal year 19, that was reactionary to what the recommendations of the administration was. Is there any administrators here? No. Shoot. I would like to say that they all had a pleasant experience coming to all of our meetings in the last 4 months. We met at least 3 times with everyone, and some we've met multiple times beyond that because we had, because some of them just like talking about school finance. We just had some issues that we needed to resolve and clarify. We also met with program directors, curriculum, special education. Spent a lot of time on special education. Very complex. We are doing some investments there, so we had to make sure we were understanding both the real-time costs and when we'd actually be seeing some of the reimbursement for that, because as you know, special education is not real-time. Costs that we're incurring in fiscal year 20 do not get part of the reimbursement calculation until fiscal year 21. So if you're doing investments now, you actually don't see the revenue benefit until a year later, so that can be very complicated. So again, as you're seeing some of these things that may look different, and again, if you have specific questions on why certain things are where, we'll have to take notes and reach out to the district or the staff, building administration to find out what changes they made, because this was really all driven by programs, their folks in their buildings, so the changes that they are doing was based on what they saw as needs for their building. So if there's something specific that we may see as a change or something that looks different, we would certainly be happy to follow up with those folks and get that more information for you. But again, you can see that at the bottom we have the total FTEs. You can correlate that back to the projected enrollment for the sites. And again, just as a reminder, those same footnotes, these estimates are subject to change. Again, the district-wide staff, there may be district-wide staff that support these buildings, but because they're coded as district-wide, we don't have an allocation to the site. And again, this does not include our facility staff, our food service, community education, or other district-wide. And these folks as well may be funded through the general fund or other restricted funds like compensatory or title. And then just going back to some of the questions that we had heard back from folks, just want to follow up on, well, maybe I'll stop here first and see if we have any questions on this portion, and then I'll go into some of the questions we had from folks that hopefully we've been able to address either through here or with follow-up.
Okay, thank you, Kathy. Member Oswald, go ahead.
When you're talking about the certified support staff FTE for like Lincoln and Ordine and Denfeld, I just was curious if all of those staff listed are available to all gen ed students, or if there are some staff that are for special ed included into that.
Is that this page?
That would be that page.
So this page does not include special ed. So these would be our regular core FTE. When you get to the ones with the green lines, you can see the breakout of who the special ed teachers are. This would be our core who are available in the regular 200 series, which would be those areas between programs 200 to 299, which is English. Special ed is program 400, so all those students would be in a separate category. Did that answer your question?
Well, it was about the staff, not students. The FTE staff. Okay.
These service all the, these are no special ed teachers.
Right, because you had mentioned it was counselors and social workers and those kinds of things, and if you have to buy general ed social workers, they don't.
Yeah.
So, okay. Thank you.
These would be those that are paid for with general education. Any special education social workers, they're all separate. They're in the separate. Yep. Thank you for that great question.
Great, and when you're asking questions, if you have something specific to a page, why don't you reference the page? The pages are all.
I wish I had put, are there page numbers on there?
I'm seeing that 17 pages.
Awesome.
Thank you. The numbers got on.
Sorry, mine did not.
That was page 15.
Awesome.
Okay, so member Sandsted and then member Trinka.
Kind of the big overall question, you started this budget process with talking about the sites with what they needed. And so I'm wondering if you can give us sort of a general picture of, they told you what they needed, and here's what they're getting. How close are we in terms of giving them the staffing that they said that they needed?
So I'm going to circle all the way back to say that we actually started out the conversation by saying, if you could live with what you have right now into next year, that's where we started the conversation. We couldn't start with what you needed because I think without going any farther, we all know we can't provide nearly as much as what everyone needs because we don't have the funding. So it became a priority of, if you have what you have, then work within that framework to decide what you need and then let us know how we can modify that budget moving forward. So we started out with the premise of, here's what we know we have, and we used 19 as a guideline because the budget was approved and these were the things that we could afford and the things that they needed in 19. And then we did see several buildings adjust both FTE and other supply budgets based on working with their staff and deciding, as you look through, I know Myers-Wilkins for sure had done quite a bit of changing. They met multiple times with their CITs. Principal Warden kind of explained to us her process, and there was some shifting of staff. I think, for example, if you were to look at what I think is page 13, they have a low second grade. So they have 13.5 students per FTE, and that was purposeful that they added that in exchange for, and then they reduced in some other places to make that work. So that within their framework of what budget we had to work with, they made some changes. Others were very similar to the prior year because their pupil counts were about the same, their class sizes were about the same, so they kept that same staffing, maybe doing some different things with some of their supply budgets. I know some who did some professional development this year are going to be using it for instructional supplies for next year because they were kind of one-time professional development opportunities that they could take advantage of. So, and certainly, if there's any specifics for the sites, you can certainly let me know and I can reach out to the administrators, but they're the best ones to kind of tell the individual stories of their buildings and what they had to work with. But I guess I would just say from a premise standpoint, it was more about, here's the confines of the revenues we have to work with, and then if we can go from there with what you have, what adjustments do you need to make? Did that answer?
Kind of.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. Member Trinka?
Yeah, thank you for that explanation. I have a couple of different questions, and you might be getting to these, and so feel free to say hold off.
You got
it. You mentioned that there were some additional investments that were being made in special education, so I'd be curious if you could speak to what those are. I think that's an important step for the district.
Thank you. Great question. So what ended up happening for the district is, as you all know, the history of our special education funding, and we could spend a great amount of time lamenting about our financial situation. Through no fault of the district, we were behind, and part of the consequence of that for the district is we had reduced in special education for the last several years, and it was very difficult. And so as we went through this process and we looked at where we were from a reimbursable standpoint and realizing that for the investments that we can make now, in fiscal year 20, we're going to see some additional reimbursement, state reimbursement. We kind of say 50 cents on the dollar will come in additional special education aid. But again, we don't see it until 21. So that's the challenge of investing now on the expense side. It takes us a year to get the revenue. And then, of course, we have the wild card of tuition billing. We've had that discussion multiple times. For as good as we can predict our own revenues and expenditures, we are at the whim of other people billing us. So if we are to get higher tuition billed next year, all the work we've done could be for nothing if they bill us more because we have more. We are monitoring that and following that very closely, but we don't find that out until February of next year what the actual tuition bill is going to be. So from that perspective, we had an opportunity to invest back in because we knew we were going to see some dollars. We increased our ADSIS application, so we have some interventionists coming in, both reading and math at this time. I will say that in the beginning in the application process, we had hoped to do more, but once we looked at the budget, we knew we couldn't add as much as we could, so I believe it's about $400,000 in that application. Last year's application was about 150, so the net increase is just that difference, but we are adding some interventionists. Part of that is because we're going to get reimbursed for those where in the past we hadn't, which was why we had not invested in those interventionists because we didn't have the dollars. But if we're going to get 50 cents on the dollar back, we felt like now was the time to start investing. We were also required to spend more on the CEIS money, which is for social emotional. And it has to do with in-school suspensions, I believe, and maybe Jeff knows more about this, but what that is we're just we are reallocating some of our folks, but we are investing more through special ed. Because of that, we were able to add some DCD staff and some other, so we shifted to pay for these the CEIS requirement, which opened up some other dollars for us to provide some other programming staff. So it was a little bit of shift of dollars, but in the end, the net increase that we have for special education is about $700,000. Keeping in mind that our anticipation is that we get about $350,000 of it as additional revenue in fiscal year 21.
Okay, great, thank you. That's a really helpful breakdown. Are you planning on providing us with a spending breakdown per site like we've had previous years?
So we had that discussion multiple times here. Because of how the structure of our budgeting is different, we are still working through how we want to make sure we're identifying those costs correctly. So how I've been presenting the budget and how traditionally the district has presented information are not in alignment. So I didn't want you to see something the old way and then something you've been following for the last 3 months that might not look the same. We have that information broken down, and I think what our plan is throughout the summer, starting, you're not going to be ending budget talks because we passed the budget in June. Our plan is to talk about it at every business committee meeting throughout the year, and so we hope to then be able to pull that information at the July meeting to kind of show you this is where the budget is and these are where the breakdowns are, because we need to do some cleanup on a whole bunch of coding is where we're at. So I didn't want to show something in one place and then 2 months later it all shows in a different place. So it's all accounted for by program area and object area, but where they are in the sites may look a little bit different.
Okay, great. And then this last question maybe is for the superintendent. When people ask us between now and Tuesday and then this summer where the referendum dollars went, how do we answer that question?
Well, I think when we look at the overall budget and I'm trying to go back to that page where the increases in the budget and the decreases in the budget are listed. I think it's page 3. Knowing that we had almost $1 million reduction in compensatory and we had almost $1 million adjustment in our levy, that's almost $2 million of it right there, and then federal reduction as well. We knew that part of this needed to go toward the budget, toward the changes that we made with compensatory to make sure that we were investing more in our sites, so we knew a good chunk of the referendum was going to that. The changes in our budgets that, the compensatory and the levy adjustment, we didn't necessarily see that coming because there was a change in our population. And so we would have had to make considerable more reductions had we not had the referendum. So the fact that we were able to maintain everything that we had and make some more investments, like in the special education and a few other areas. We've added some of those interventionists so that all of our schools have interventionists. We were able to make some investments, but because of the changes in revenues, we weren't able to get as far as we were hoping to. I would still say that the referendum is still funding at least 25 teachers that would not have been here if we did not have the referendum.
Okay, Member Sandstead.
So I'm going to start off with that piece first, in that when we were preparing for the referendum, we did a survey and we talked about class sizes. And there was, I wish I had it with me, but I seem to recall that the class size numbers that were used in the call were something like 25 kids per class average for elementary and 30 at the secondaries. Is that right?
We weren't using, we didn't use class size at all with that. We only used the language of 25 teachers, that it would support 25 teachers.
In the survey before we decided which to ask for.
You know, I'd have to go back and look at it.
Could you find though, because I actually do think that there's a significant difference here in what we talked about our historical numbers being, and now looking at class sizes in elementary of being around 20 to 21 on average, and 25 at the high school. These seem like smaller numbers than what we were operating with in discussing referendum options. And then on that, in terms of the elementary, Congdon has the highest average class size. Structurally in the building in Congdon, we would be limited from adding additional regular classes. Is that correct? Like there's no physical space to add more classrooms, is my understanding.
I think that there are a few rooms that could be used differently if we made some changes in how we're programming those rooms. But yeah, we're about out of room there.
Okay.
It would be something like we'd have to look at the music room or the art room and then have those specialists rotate. I know the Key Zone has a room, and we'd have to utilize those rooms and then find other places or other ways to meet those needs.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to keep going till I get cut off here. There was a classification on pages 16 and 17, and there's a line for paraprofessionals and then special ed paraprofessionals. And I don't understand the difference. If you could just enlighten me.
So not all paraprofessionals work with special ed students, so that's the difference there. Some sites have decided that as part of their funds, they would like to use paraprofessionals for their gen ed staff as well. So the special ed paraprofessionals only work with the special ed students.
Yeah. So are these like a classroom will have a general paraprofessional in it, or are they float around the building? What are their uses generally?
Mostly these are supervisory paraprofessionals, and so they are, they might be posted at a door, they might be in the halls, they're working with students, they're not generally in the classroom.
Okay, so more building work, but for all students.
Yep.
Got it. Thank you.
Could I just follow up quickly on that average class size? I just took that spreadsheet, and I know from top to bottom, and I don't know if you added up, it's about 24 per student, just because
Average.
there's so many more students at Congdon, and their average skews the rest. So you have to watch some of the buildings that have the lowest class sizes also have the smallest amount of students. So, thank you.
I should have asked. Spreadsheet wizard. In terms of the ADSIS and CEIS interventionists and staff, how many people are we talking, and where are they going to be located, those additional folks?
So if you look at the sheet, I think my numbers are different because I'm looking at it in CAMI. Mine's page 15. It's the one with all of the different positions and the elementaries across the top. If you look at the line that says interventionists, and then it has, like Congdon has 1.5, Homecroft 1, Lakewood 0.6. Those interventionists, those are the reading and math interventionists that we're talking about, although their funding sources may be different depending on the site. So some of those are funded with ADSIS, some are CEIS, some could be title, some could be general fund, some are compensatory. So those are the positions. ADSIS, I believe, is Homecroft, Lester Park, and Congdon?
Congdon and Lakewood.
Oh, and we added Lakewood this year, yeah.
So if I was looking at past year interventionists, we'd see an increase in the numbers overall.
Right, not all sites had interventionists.
Okay.
We were able to add some with the expansion of ADSIS.
Okay, thank you.
Member Gorham?
So just one note I wanted to clarify in the referendum too. Perhaps a talking point, I see budgeted $500,000 going into our fund balance, which hopefully we don't have to touch, but gives us perhaps some flexibility in terms of targeting hotspots with class size. Just want to point that out. That's definitely one thing I'll be sharing. But yeah, I'm glad to see us taking steps in that direction too, because that's the flexibility we've lacked and that we need to start somewhere. So I'm glad to see that $500,000 there, and I hope it can stay and keep growing.
And just to follow up, if we had $1 for every time we decided to try to spend that because there were so many other needs, I can tell you that we would have spent that $500,000 because, again, it was a purposeful reserve to put there. But again, I think it lends itself to the exact thing that Member Gorham just said. It's there that between now and September, between now and January, between now and June 30th of 2020, if those dollars are there and something unexpected happens, we've got that available to us, where right now if something unexpected were to happen, we really just don't have anything. So certainly I wish that could be $1 million, because we could strive to try to get to that $8 million goal that we have, but that would take us 8 years still to get to that. And again, we have a lot of work ahead of us in analyzing and trying to find the best efficient use of our funds. But again, I appreciate that our administrative team, when we met with all the building administrators, we were very candid about that was a portion of this budget that needed to stay there, even though if you were to ask every building principal, could they use more funds? Absolutely. I mean, as I shared when I first got here, every meeting I had, I would be like, I got to get that person more money. They deserve more money. And there's so much that we could do, but this is a very, I think it is a critical piece of our process, and I'm very grateful that it's a part of that. So thank you.
Okay. Just back onto the interventionist. Well, so each site determined how many or what percentage of interventionist time they wanted, right? I just wanted to clarify that, because there's differences.
Yes, and I'm glad you mentioned that. That's the other thing we wanted to mention as far as looking at the sheets and looking at the summaries up here. keep in mind that when you see an FTE, that doesn't necessarily equate to a person because many of our people are less than 1.0 FTEs. So if you might see 1.5, that could actually be 3 people. It could be 4 people. It could be 4 bodies. So to keep everything consistent, we had to go with FTEs because that's what so we had to kind of keep it there. But as far as what those numbers represent, they could represent multiple people.
Member Kirby and then Member Osborne.
Thanks. I just want to follow up with what the question Member Trinka asked about what we tell people about class size. I think that was a good one. And Member Gorham, I actually looked up and looked at the ballot and what it said and then looked at what the district website said about those. The ballot didn't say anything other than vote for this and it will raise your taxes by this much money. But what our website said and what the district was saying was if we passed that, which we did, would add approximately 25 teachers district-wide to manage class size. And you mentioned that if we didn't have this, we would be cutting them. So it's kind of going around it, but it does that. Increase site funding for specific supports based on need and support financial stability. So all of those things were part of that question as the website said. So people may focus on class size, but it had a variety of issues on there.
Thank you. Member Oswald and then Member Trinka.
I had a question about the interventionists also. How can we tell where they're adding math ADSYS people versus the reading ones?
That is a decision that is led by the CITs, looking at the needs and their readiness to do that. We want everyone, we started off, we wanted everyone to start with literacy because that is our number one goal. Two of our sites wanted to work with some behavior before going into literacy, and so they took a little more time with SEL work and then worked on literacy. Some are a little farther down the road than others, and so they are starting with math. And I know that Congdon is one that is starting with math, and I'm going to have to look at who the others are, but we are purchasing the math intervention materials for all sites so that when they are ready, they have the materials that we've chosen as the Tier 2 intervention materials. And everyone has the Tier 2 and Tier 3 literacy materials and has been trained. So we can get back to you on that. I bet Jeff can answer that, though, because he remembers.
Just to answer a few questions that have been floating around about interventionists and funding and whatnot, and kind of going back to what Kathy had mentioned earlier. We do have CEIS funds and ADSYS funds, which can both be used to fund interventionists. We received notice from the Minnesota Department of Education Special Education Office that we needed to use CEIS funds for behavior. We had been identified as a district that had to take 15% of our special education budget, set it aside, and use that for early intervention for behavior. We already were doing a lot of that work, and so what we did is we took those funds and used those for work that we're already doing to support that. The ADSYS, by moving those funds over, we would have potentially seen a loss in ADSYS, but because of our funding and because we've been so good and so careful about our spending the last few years, we were actually able to put that into the ADSYS application to receive more funding actually, and then also expand beyond that. For the next 2 years, which are, this is it's not really grant, it's a funding application. It goes in a 2-year cycle. So for the next 2 years, Congdon Park will have reading and math, projected to serve 93 students. Homecroft will have reading, which is projected to serve 57 students. Lakewood will have reading, which is projected to service 30 students. And Lester Park will have reading and math, which is projected to service 86 students.
Member Trinka.
Thank you. This is a process question. Going back to the fund balance piece, and thank you, Member Gorham, for reminding us of that. How do we get to make a decision as a board as to whether or not we touch that? I mean, from a process standpoint, can we put it in a lockbox and just say, no, we can't touch it, or, because there's financial scope creep. And if we've committed to getting to $8 million, then I want to support us in making those hard decisions that we have to in order to do that. So from a process standpoint, how will we know if that money is touched, and what, if any, role does the board have in thumbs up or thumbs down to touching that money?
That is a great question, and I wish I could say that you have a lockbox. You do not have a lockbox. The fund balance is the result of the total revenues plus total expenditures and looking at where we are. For example, at any one time through board action, you're approving this budget right now. This is our projection as we see it right now. We're projecting a slight deficit actually in the general fund and hopefully balanced in other places. First day of school rolls around and we have to add FTEs because all of a sudden we got an influx of students, which would be fantastic. That will change our expenditure side. Hopefully it will also change our revenue side as well. But if they don't tie out, whatever that net changes will be an impact on that fund balance. So as far as saying, could you say, I'm sorry, you have to stop spending because we need to get there. We have contractual obligations. 80% of our budget is tied up in people. If we have, a bunch of people get their master's degree this next year and we have to do pay increases and we are unaware of that, we still have to pay those. We can't say, I'm sorry, we don't have any money, we can't pay you. So part of the reason you have a fund balance is for those unexpected things. Certainly our goal, the administration's goal, our staff goal is to maintain those budget line items, and we certainly intend to monitor those very closely to make sure we're staying where we are, because I've said in just about every meeting I've been in with folks here is we don't have a safety net. The fund balance is the safety net, and we don't have one yet. And even though we may be putting some dollars there, which I hope we will, we may not. If something comes up that we're not prepared for, we would need to do that, and that's probably our resource. So it is that last line of defense before you start, talking about being unbalanced. So I'm sorry.
Superintendent Grunsack.
Thank you. I just wanted to kind of build on that a little bit. That certainly our hope would be not to touch that. Usually when we're doing a budget, when we do a construction budget, we build in contingency, and this budget is built extremely tight, and we have to come in under 1% difference. And so, this is, remember those commercials, off the balcony, off the back wall, backwards, I feel a little bit like that's where we are. Like, we have to make the perfect shot on this budget to get it within 1% variation. So, I applaud all the work that has been done by everyone to really hone this in, but it is extremely tight.
Okay, Member Sandsted.
So we talk about fund balance and we talk about reserves, and I asked you, CFO Erickson, to explain to me where the Hartley sale money is going, if not into the reserve, and you explained it to me, but I don't really understand. So I'm wondering, for the benefit of everybody, if you can describe where that money will go and what it is available for.
Thank you for that great question. So when we have a property sale, statute requires us to put that into the reserve for operating capital. So we have a reserve account. For those of you in UFAR's world, that would be our Finance 302, balance sheet 424. My goal is at some point someone's just going to throw out random numbers and I'm like, you knew what that meant. We have discussed this current year we had a Hartley sale, so we had some proceeds. Part of those dollars have already been committed to the local match for the COPS grant that you've heard about. That was at Education Committee. At our last meetings, there was a local match that was required to move that forward, so we did dedicate part of those dollars already. We have also had internal discussions for using one of the main uses for operating capital dollars is facilities equipment. We have literally in our buildings no good facilities equipment to do our cleaning and maintenance in our buildings. So we have worked to find a lease to own process. So our goal was if we were to get future sale proceeds, if that should happen, we'd be dedicating part of that for that facilities, that 3-year lease purchase, and then those would maintain in that reserve for operating capital. So we have a fund balance projection set aside for that, and then there are uses that are projected as well.
But these property sales dollars do not go into the general fund balance.
They do not. So they are in reserve, keeping in mind. So there's a way to get to general fund savings because we have things that we're paying out of the general fund that qualify for operating capital uses. We just don't have enough money. We have more eligible capital needs than we do funding, so we spend those out of our general fund. So in theory, the district could take expenditures out of the general fund, use our eligible operating capital money to save that, which would in turn help the general fund. So we would have some uses there, but I think that's part of the future discussion items that we have for our administrative budget meetings, which are really fun and exciting, is to make sure that we do plan for those because in a district this size and with the amount of people, it's amazing when people hear that there's money, that there are already people that have spent that money, many people. And so we have to make sure that we're very diligent and make sure that we understand, again, what those effective and efficient use of those funds are and what impacts of making one decision could be, not just now, but into the future. That is a very important discussion that we're going to continue to have here is that these are one-time dollars, so we want to make sure that we don't utilize those for ongoing costs because that's not sustainable. So that's why we were looking at equipment purchases because those would be one-time costs associated with one-time dollars.
Can you tell us a ballpark of what general fund dollars we are paying that could be used for operating capital expenditures instead?
So great question. So any textbooks, facilities equipment, we have many of those things running out of the general fund right now. Technology is a huge one. We have our technology budget, part of that running through there, but as you all know, we have many things that are earmarked back to the general fund that we could code back to operating capital. Bus purchases, money of that runs through our general fund transportation, but could also be paid. Any vehicle purchases could be run through operating capital. So we have hundreds of thousands of dollars that could be coded to operating capital that is currently in our undesignated general account. Just again, because the operating capital fund is limited to start out with and we have greater needs.
So hundreds of thousands, not necessarily millions of dollars.
Like when we did the literacy adoption, that was over $1 million in textbooks. We know that we have science changes in the standards coming up. Math, we're going to have to do another adoption. So there is, that could be millions of dollars within the next few years just in textbooks.
Okay, thank you.
And just to follow up, even like with transportation, our transportation cycle is way behind. We could spend $500,000 on buses and still be behind. So could I get to $1 million in 5 minutes? I could. But from a year perspective, year to year, there are literally hundreds of thousands a year that are just stable.
But as far as things that we've planned for expenditures within general fund that could be replaced, if we sold Central tomorrow, then the general fund that we've been putting away for textbooks could then stay there, and we could use those capital funds for that purchase instead.
Okay, any more questions, anybody? Okay.
So just in conclusion, if you have any other follow-up questions, please email myself, the superintendent, or Peggy so that we can get back to you before Tuesday's board meeting. What you'll see is page 1 of this report. You'll see this report again, but the budget that we'll be asking you to adopt will be the summary by revenue and expenditure by fund on page 1, which is those in total. And again, keeping in mind that we have an adopted budget that's required by statute by June 30th, but on July 1, we can amend the budget. On July 2nd, we can amend there's a adopted and a revised, and we are committed to working through all of this with all of you as we get better information. Once the school year starts, once we get more pupil count information, we will continue to edit both the revenue and expenditure side to make sure that we're kind of keeping track of where we are. Again, we're looking at streamlining and updating some of our coding structures so that we can follow up and provide more information to you on a regular basis, which I know you're all very much looking forward to. And again, hopefully that will help us in monitoring what we say is a very, very tight budget. So I really appreciate the opportunity to have these extra days to keep going through. And as we leave here today, Peggy and I have nothing but spreadsheets in front of us every single day for 8, 10, 12 hours a day, and we are continuing to work through those and make sure that, with the, over 1,000 people that work here, all of our sites, all of our processes, there are thousands and thousands of codes we're monitoring and reviewing, so we continue to do that. And as we see any adjustments or changes, we'll be coming back to you with updates as well.
Okay, any last questions? Okay, great, thank you. So we will be getting our packet with this information in it. And again, if you have questions, send them to Kathy and Bill. And then we look forward to seeing everybody at our June 18th meeting. Do I need a motion to adjourn? No. Okay, let's adjourn. Thank you.